This is a quick tutorial on how to use the Gemini web interface to update your Gemini firmware. This assumes that you already have an Ethernet connection working between your Windows computer and your Gemini. We're not going to cover those details here. There are other tutorials available for that. Before we get started, you should have already downloaded the available Gemini firmware and extracted the .bin file to your computer. In this example, I've extracted it here. And one recommendation I have is to rename the firmware file so that you can easily manage multiple versions if need be. So in this example, I'm going to put in the year and the month and maybe some other indicator, A, in case there's a B or a C that comes later this month. Okay. Now we are going to type in and access the Gemini. It may ask you for the login information. The default username is admin and the password is blank. And this is the web interface to the Gemini computer. So we navigate to the SD card. And here when we scroll down, we'll be able to find a file to upload to the SD card. Now I'm going to choose a file and select the firmware that I just renamed. And I'm going to send this to the SD card. And this is just a quick upload. You'll see that it's listed here. And now we're going to go back to the home screen and we're going to choose firmware. And one thing I want to do before I do that is I want to click the Store SRAM because we're going to want to reset the Gemini to HGM defaults just to make sure. It's not really required, but we're just going to do that to make sure. So the first thing I want to do is click Store SRAM, and that will store my settings for the Gemini to a local file. Now we choose the firmware that we want to upgrade to, and you can see all these various firmware versions. I'm going to choose the one that I just selected and click Flash Firmware. It's going to ask me if I want to do that. And at this point, it's flashing the firmware and it's going to restart the Gemini. So you're going to need to give this 15-20 seconds. If it takes longer, definitely allow it to take a few minutes or more. It should reboot and come back to the screen. And here we can see that it gives us the new information for the Gemini firmware information. At this point, we can also choose to reset the SRAM, which we did. And then we're going to load the SRAM that we stored. And there's only one file that's stored. So whatever we saved from the SRAM before, now it's reloaded back in. So now from the home page of the Gemini web server, we can go back to the firmware page and we can see here that we can select from a variety of firmware versions that are available on our SD card. So the nice thing about relabeling your binary file, your .bin file, is that if you need to back up or change the version for some reason, you can just have them all listed here and just choose it. Again, you're going to want to store the SRAM, flash the firmware, then reset the SRAM, and then load your SRAM again. From time to time, it's possible you may run into Gemini being unreachable. There's a couple different reasons why this might be the case. One is the Gemini is not finished updating the firmware, or two, and probably more likely, your IP address has been reset in the Gemini and it can't be connected with. This is part of the reason why for firmware process, we prefer using a router and NetBIOS name recognition because you aren't tied to a specific IP address. However, you can just power cycle your Gemini, or it will also try to refresh the page periodically. And at some point it will reboot and the page will come back up. If you need to update the hand controller firmware, it's a similar process, except now when we go into the SD card, we're going to find a folder called HC Firmware. If it's not there, you're going to need to either access the Gemini via FTP and create that folder, or you can pull the SD card and create it in your Windows computer. So in this case, we choose a file, and this would be our new hand controller file. We open it and we send it. So that's all that's required. The next time the Gemini is rebooted with a hand controller connected, when the hand controller connects to the Gemini, it will update its firmware.